Peter Carson here. I'm going to get into intros and such, but today's session is called Getting Your Systems to Talk with Fabric. And this is really all about Microsoft Fabric and what we call a Medallion Master Data Management architecture. It's not a Fabric concept, but it's definitely something that Microsoft has embraced as an architecture and structure here. As you can see on the diagram there, we've got a lot of different systems that we use at Envision IT. We're actually going to use ourselves as a guinea pig and kind of take you through how we've been integrating all those different systems with each other. So from a Teams meeting point of view, we're actually using a Teams webinar. So everybody is muted, but chat is open. So feel free to ask questions as we're going through. It's going to be a small group, so I will try and have a look at questions, or if Kevin, you're going to be moderating. If you see something that's particularly relevant to the topic being discussed, feel free to jump in and we can talk about it then, but we can also take questions at the end. We are recording the webinar, so we're going to share that up within 24 hours. So welcome, enjoy, and learn. So as I mentioned, Peter Carson here, president and founder of Envision IT, also a Microsoft MVP, do speaking at industry conferences and such. Also run the local Toronto Microsoft 365 user group. So the slides as well as the recording will be available. So all the links and details will be available from there. So I'm actually not sure if this is going to be a 30-minute or a 45 or somewhere in between session. Kevin, our CMO, was encouraging me to keep them a little bit shorter. That 30 minutes was a little more palatable for people. There's a fair bit to go over, but this is part 1 of 6, so there's a lot of follow-on sessions from here. We'll walk through our various different systems, what we keep where, and how we might want to integrate those together. We'll touch on Fabric, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, take you through what that looks like. And then dive deeper into the master data management and Medallion architecture. A lot of the time is going to be live walkthrough, so I've got a lot to share and show on the Fabric side, and as we mentioned, QA throughout, but also we'll have a look at the chat at the end of the session too. Some key takeaways I'd like people to take from this. Often organizations have the same data in different systems, but often it isn't the same. There's this idea of system of record, and unfortunately, each department may feel that their own data is the truth or the system of record, and that's obviously not true if you've got it in multiple spots and they all think it's the master. That needs to be decided. And the reality is that often different departments own different parts of it. I mean, a classic example is I give talks on people search, and we have a Staff 365 directory that can be deployed to an intranet. That's often a tension between HR and IT, because HR runs the HRIS and the payroll system, and they feel their system is the system of record for staff, but then IT runs the systems in terms of mailboxes and licenses and sign-ons and such. That's also a system of record. And the reality is each staff member has information that comes from each that kind of needs to be drawn together. And that's really what today's topic is about. So the end goal is a well-architected solution. It's not only going to be more accurate, you're not going to have disconnects that says, oh, HR says the job title is this, and the people card in Microsoft 365 says the job title is that, and they're not the same. So accuracy is obviously really important, but it's also much more productive. And we've seen this internally at Envision IT as we've been streamlining our systems. It's really made a difference from a productivity perspective. Okay, so we're going to come back to this slide a little bit later, but we're going to go through each of these systems just at a high level to kind of explain what we use where. So actually, why don't I go to the details for each of them? And I'm going to start with HubSpot. We used to be a Dynamics shop. We are a Microsoft partner. We like to use the Microsoft tools. We found that HubSpot was better for our size business. We're about 24 people, and we've really standardized on that. That's where we run our marketing, our sales, our customer service. But we really run our business. We run project management. We run software licenses, lots of different things through HubSpot. So if we look on the right side, those are sort of the data points that we predominantly use at Envision IT. So we've got obviously a directory of companies and contacts. That's sort of the core CRM functionality of HubSpot. We keep deals in there from a lead pipeline perspective that ultimately turn into quotes that then turn into projects that we deliver as part of our consulting side of our business. We also sell licenses that bring in the SaaS product side of the business, and those licenses get deployed that need to be tracked. And then obviously there's website activity from a marketing perspective. Even registering for this webinar gets written into HubSpot. So it's really sort of the starting master point for a lot of the data at Envision IT. But even within it itself, there's components that need to update each other. When projects become inactive and we're not working on them anymore, do those companies become inactive? There's data connections even within the entities in HubSpot, which we could automate through workflows in HubSpot, and we did do some of that. It just gets to be a bit of a tangled mess with all these different workflows running. It's better to have a consolidated central repository for your data and then push those results out to the different systems, which is what we're going to be taking you through. So if I look over onto HubSpot for a second here, wrong window, bear with me. Here we go. So this is our HubSpot. We actually started to set up a sandbox for the demo. We didn't get all the way through, but we have a couple of sample clients set up in here. So this is our Contoso EOM demo client that we use for example purposes. And this is, the out-of-the-box company record in HubSpot, but we've extended and added lots of additional fields and properties to it. But then we've also added a lot of relationships to other entities in HubSpot. So we can see here, we don't have any deals open right now, but we've got 2 quotes that we prepared from a sales point of view that involve both licenses and software projects. We can see the projects themselves. We can see the licenses. So all of these entities are hung off of the company records. If I come over, say, to quotes, for example, this quote has an approved status. It has a budget associated with it. These are all just made up numbers. But we can see there's actually multiple companies associated with the quote. There's the client, but there's also a partner. A lot of our work we do through partners. We need to track, are we billing the partner? Are we doing the client? Do we need to pay the partner a referral fee for that? So all that complexity gets managed through HubSpot. But ultimately it needs to get into our billing systems from there. So that's kind of the next item I think on my list here is on the QuickBooks side. So we use QuickBooks Online as our cloud-based accounting platform. It works well for our size of business. It supports multi-currency, which is a big thing for us. So again, we're tracking customers and contacts in here. So, so this is sort of the second instance of those entities, HubSpot and QuickBooks. But here we also have invoices and bills. We deal with multi-currency, payroll, taxes, all that kind of stuff is happening here in QuickBooks. The third system is actually something that we built 20 plus years ago. We call it SPLAT affectionately. It was the software project lifecycle and time tracking. In fact, many of our staff probably don't even know what that name means now because it's been a long time since we built it. But it's kind of evolved. It was an on-premises, running on a SQL server that we literally had in our office, and then it moved to the cloud. It's got sort of refreshed as the Microsoft stack has changed in there. But again, we've got clients, quotes, projects, the same entities that we were seeing in HubSpot over in here. And this is where we do our time tracking. So this drives a lot of our billing processes and into QuickBooks. So you can start to see how these different systems interrelate. So if I come back over here, here's our SPLAT time tracking. So it's literally a calendar view that staff can come in, pick a spot to say, hey, I'm working on a particular project here. And for this client, I've got some tasks. Maybe this is some planning work. I can put my details in here, change how long I was working on it, and record that information. And I can flip over and look at other staff and see what they're working on. The green means it's internal. The blue means it's client billable work. So we can actually see, what's billable, what's internal, what are the main projects that Aaron's working on through here. Now, this is a demo data set that we populated from prod. We've changed all the client names, so we're not actually working for an organization called Summit Healthcare. That's just a translation of that. Okay, let's come back here. The next one is our own product, Extranet User Manager. So it's really about providing scalable, simple, secure external collaboration on top of Microsoft 365. So we bring clients into branded portals, let them access their projects, their documents and such through there. So we've got obviously users and clients and partners and projects. So again, the same data set repeated here. So you're starting to see a pattern. We've got the same data existing in a lot of different systems. And historically, it was all manual. One person would set things up here, somebody else would set things up here, and hopefully they're consistent with each other. But obviously, there's a lot of opportunity for things like leakage from a billing point of view, not tracking things properly, having inconsistencies through the data. I didn't get a chance to get the demo version of this fully up just yet. It's not showing our projects and project repository information. We'll have that for one of the later sessions when we talk about how we push this data into the other systems. But this is an example of a client site for one of our clients. We can see we've got people in the client here. I can add new contacts in through here, whether those are existing or I enter them in new or paste them from my Outlook to give access into this area here. And this is a piece that we actually haven't built in our integration just yet. We're kind of getting the master data record together first and then pushing the data back to say, hey, if I had a new contact through here, wouldn't it be great if that contact went into HubSpot so they were there from a marketing point of view? Or if they were already in HubSpot, when I go to add them here, can I just search from HubSpot and drop them in? All of those things are possible once we've got the data talking between these different systems. And then there's Teams and SharePoint. So underneath that site, you can't really see it here. There's links to the SharePoint and the Teams behind this. So all the documents related to the project are available through Teams and through SharePoint. And we have a standard template. We actually create a new channel for each client. We connect that to its own site collection in SharePoint, and we've got a structure around what do we share with the client and what do we keep private on our side. Again, we'll share those details in later sessions when we get into the push side of it. But obviously, this is a big part of our business process. And we still got user clients, partners, projects all crossing over into here. So we're now at, I've kind of lost count, 5 or 6 different systems that are all using that same data. And then let's think about the consumption side. And actually, Excel isn't just the consumption side. It's actually an input side to it as well. It's kind of frightening how much most businesses run on Excel. There's generally spreadsheets everywhere in organizations, and this is a big challenge. It often has inconsistent data feeding into it, which means it's going to have inconsistent data coming out of it. What sales sees versus what operations sees, versus what management sees, maybe 2, 3 different stories. How do you consolidate that? So having the Excel feed from this master data record is super important. Now, we also use it as an input. We do things like resource projections. So when we're kind of planning out who's going to work on what project and what does that look like going forward into the future, that feeds into our Power BI and our weekly resourcing meeting that we do. So we can say, hey, which staff are under resourced that we need to get some more project work going for them, or which projects are under resourced, and we got to figure out who's available that we can put onto that work. All that happens through here. Sorry, a little sneeze there. So Excel is obviously a big part of that. And Excel, a lot of people aren't aware, actually has a ton of power underneath it. I mean, it's got a whole tabular data model and Power Query. It's basically a database engine inside of Excel. In fact, it's the same database engine that Fabric and Power BI use as well. So there's a lot you can do right in Excel itself. But if you can standardize and pull it together into a common Fabric place, that's better than having that logic spread out through a lot of different Excels. And right now, we're still in that lot of different Excels phase. We're slowly starting to pull these together and say, okay, now point these Excels at that master data. And then Power BI, I love. I mean, we couldn't run our business without Power BI. The ability to have the interactive dashboards that show what's happening on the business, what's our revenue going to be next month, and who's working on what projects, and are we overutilized, or are we resource constrained, are we trying to find work for staff? Being able to answer those questions immediately on a day-to-day basis based on projections and time tracking data is something we really depend on for Power BI. And then there's Fabric. So this is the topic for the whole series. It's Microsoft's unified end-to-end data platform. So this idea of a one lake in a lake house, which is a Fabric element, we've got a couple on the right side there, is really that idea of a single source of the truth. To say, hey, we're going to draw from all these different systems. We're going to decide priority orders of who gets precedence on owning not just a particular record, but a field within those records. If you think of companies, for example, there's data in QuickBooks, in HubSpot, in our time tracking, And each of those systems actually share a piece of what the overall view of a company is. This is actually becoming really important as we get into the AI world. If you want to have an AI interface, and there's some really cool stuff Microsoft's doing with Power BI and AI to build visualizations on the fly, that all falls apart if you don't have a good data set underneath it. So building this to pull that all together, super, super important. Okay, I'm going to obviously dive a lot deeper into Fabric as we get in here, but let's keep going for a second here. So I'm going to come back to our opening infographic. We've got all of our systems on the left here that we've gone through. They're all feeding into this master data management in the middle. But you can see they're actually all feeding out as well. And this is actually true. Each of these systems actually both contribute data to the master data record, but they also consume data from that as well. So that's a very important point. And we're using what's called a medallion architecture. This is something coined by Databricks, not a Microsoft vendor, a different vendor. But as I mentioned, it's something that Microsoft has definitely adopted as a suggested architecture for Fabric systems. And the idea here is these bronze, silver, and gold layers. So if we start on the left here, we've got all our different data sources. I didn't put all the icons in here. I wanted to keep it generic. These are your business systems within your organization. In our case, that's our HubSpot. I would say HubSpot is our ERP for us as well. Splat is our line of business system. HRIS is arguably Entra ID and QuickBooks. The finance is another one through there. So you've got all these data source systems. And they all represent that data in very different ways. They've all got their own schema in terms of like, what are the fields that represent a company? Well, they're going to be different in each of those systems. So the idea is you start by ingesting into the bronze layer here, and it's just raw data ingestion. We're just taking the records from these systems and getting it into a standard place that we can work with from there. But the idea is not to do any data transformation here. You actually want it literally with the field names and structure of the source system from there. Because you want to be able to look at that and say, if something's wrong in this process, did we just load the wrong data from the source system, or did we transform it somehow incorrectly? What does that look like? So we want to keep all the transformations out of the bronze layer. So data quality is fairly low at this point. We've still got all these disparate records. They've all got different structures to them. They all have their version of the truth, which may not be the master record as part of that. But that's okay. That's what bronze is for. As we move to the right, we come to the silver layer. At this level, what we're trying to do is normalize and resolve the data. What that means is let's get to a standard schema. So if we've got slightly different names for company name and all the different source systems, let's pick one and standardize across that. And let's normalize the raw bronze data from all those different systems into a cleaned up data set here. So this is where you start to do data transformations and get it into a standard structure. But it's still one record per source system. So if we've got companies coming from 6 different systems, we're still going to have 6 company records here. That's okay. But the key is at the bronze layer, we had 6 company records that looked completely different from each other. We couldn't compare them because the field names don't even match. So when we get to silver, we're doing that normalization, and we say, now we can start to do comparisons from there. And then the third layer, the gold, is the important. At this point here, we've gone from six versions of each company in bronze to 6 versions of each company in silver. We want a single company record at the gold. And that doesn't mean that the gold gets the HubSpot record or it gets the QuickBooks record or it gets the Splat record. It's going to be some combination of those. And you basically need to start to build rules to say, what data point do I want to consider authoritative from which system as I build that gold record? And there's some debate around this. Like, we haven't completely decided this. HubSpot is our master for a lot of things. So what we call a company in HubSpot should be what we see into that gold record. But in QuickBooks, there's maybe a legal company name there from a billing point of view that might be a little different than what we want to call it in HubSpot. So we've actually kept both of those fields in the gold record. There's a main company name, and then there's a billing company name. We might want to standardize that and say, you know what, we should call it the same in HubSpot and QuickBooks. And if they're different, we can have a data reconciliation process to say, hey, one of those systems needs to get updated, either QuickBooks or HubSpot to match the other. And that's really the process on the right side here to say, let's push this gold data. Once we've decided, what are all our different entities, companies, contacts, projects, quotes, things like that, and what data comes from where for each of those, how do we push that back to the source systems? So if we say company name is mastered in HubSpot, and we've changed the company name in HubSpot. Well, where else do we need to change it as part of that? Should we go change it in QuickBooks? Do we need to change it in Splat? Do we need a different name for the Teams channel in Teams? Does the Extranet User Manager company group need to change its name? Probably yes for all of that. So there's going to be a bunch of pushes that happen from the gold records back to those operational systems. And this is a key difference of what we're talking about in this webinar series. It's not just about driving analytics and reporting. When you see this medallion architecture in most blogs and Microsoft Learn articles and things like that, they're talking about how do I take all of my disparate systems in my business, get them to a standard canonical master data record so I can get decent reporting coming out of that. And that's an important goal, absolutely. But in my mind, that's only a small piece of it. The bigger piece is how do I get that canonical data back into all the relevant operational systems? How do we get all my systems that are owned by different departments in the organization to all say the same thing? If we've decided that, a particular property is going to be mastered in a particular spot, let's push it to the other areas from there. And this is something that we're doing with lots of different clients. We've got Mold Masters is a global manufacturer. They have SAP as their ERP. They're obviously a much bigger global company than we are. They also have Salesforce that has a ton of data in it. They've got their engineering systems for doing engineering drawings and such. So we've got 3 main systems and then a bunch of other ones from there. And they all have versions, just like we have here, that need to get consolidated together. So we're just starting that process with them to say, hey, can we get data feeds from these different systems, bring them into Fabric, consolidate that data, and populate it out? In that scenario, the goal is actually to build a customer portal that their customers can come in and review sales orders and engineering drawings and approve things as part of that. So we want to make sure that all the right information is coming in and being presented to the customer from there. So as we're moving left to right, our data quality obviously is increasing, and this should be very high quality data at this point as we get to gold that we can then push out to the operational systems. But we can also build awesome dashboards in Power BI. We can do lots of things in Excel with that data. And later sessions, we're going to talk about both of those topics as part of this series as well. Okay, so let's actually dive into Fabric. I've been going for 23 minutes, so let's actually show some live stuff here. I had Fabric open, maybe not. Fabric.microsoft.com. It's easy to remember. It does tend to default to Power BI when you come in because that's a big part of it. I can flip it from the bottom here into the Fabric view. It doesn't really change, just changes the UI that we see through here. So I've got a bunch of different workspaces that we've set up in here. And this is an important point. Actually, my next session is going to be talking about is software development lifecycle. Like, how do you build this from an enterprise point of view? You don't want to be building live in production and writing data back to live systems. You need sandbox areas to work on that. So we have a integration dev 2. Our demo is the one that I'm going to be using, and our prod workspace. And we actually use Git as a source control to sync all this and move it between environments. So we're not going to go too far on that. We're going to talk more about that in the seconds in this series. But let's go into the EIT integration demo. This is the demo workspace that I'm working on. And you can see we've got a number of different Fabric artifacts. In fact, let me start by saying, hey, if I want to create a new item, what are the things that I can do in Fabric? And it's showing me my recents because I do a lot of work with lakehouses, notebooks, pipelines, and Dataflow Gen 2s. I don't actually do much with Spark Job Definition. I think I just dove into it. But you can see there's a lot of other different things. I mean, we can use copy jobs, event streams, Spark jobs to go get data. When I first started building stuff in Fabric, probably 6-8 months ago, I did a lot of copy jobs and logic apps as my integration path. It worked. The logic app started to get pretty complicated. I'm actually going to show you what we're doing in QuickBooks as part of that. But more importantly, I found it very difficult to move between environments. There was so much configuration baked into those copy job steps that as you moved, say, from a dev to a test to a prod environment, it was tough to manage that move. So I really standardized on notebooks, which is basically code, as my main data connection to pull data in. And then data flows is Power Query. It's the same that you would use in Excel or Power BI to manipulate. We're going to look at both of those elements. And then pipelines kind of wire that together. It says, here's the sequence of steps that I want you to run, and go ahead and schedule that from there. But you can see there's a ton of other items in here, both where you consume from, where you store data to, how you want to prepare it or analyze it or train. So there's a lot in Fabric. So I'm not going to cover all that as part of this session. I'm going to focus on basically those elements that we're going to be using here. So I'm going to start at the pipeline level because it's kind of the master level. As I mentioned, it's the orchestration of what's happening here. And it's a pretty simple orchestration right now. I've turned off the last step, which is to push data back into source systems. I don't want to push out of my demo environment back into our live production HubSpot. I've been working on getting a sandbox HubSpot going so we can play around with that. But basically, it's two notebooks to go gather some data and a data flow to massage that. And the first notebook is pulling in a bunch of HubSpot data, and the second notebook is reading into our extranet user manager product and pulling that information in. Inside of the data flow, it's actually going into our time tracking software, which is in SQL. We didn't actually need a notebook to read that because the data flow could read right from Azure SQL for that. So let's look at the copy HubSpot data. Now, there's a ton of code in here. I'm open to sharing some of the elements that I've created here. Like if you're using HubSpot yourself and you want to build a data integration, I think I should probably just put this up in my GitHub and make it available. Not the entirety of what we're doing here, but there's a bunch of helper modules that I've created. And in all fairness, Copilot helped me a ton to create this. I'm not a Python developer, which is the language that this is in. I knew nothing about this when I started working with notebooks 2-3 months ago. Same goes for Tom and Guri, two of our senior developers. We've all relied on GitHub Copilot and M365 Copilot to help us build a lot of the code here. It's not that we let it vibe code and we don't even check what it's doing, but looking at a blank slate and not knowing where to start and saying, hey, I'd like something to do this in Python and have it give a sample script and then refine through a lot of iterations is actually a really productive way of building this out. So notebooks have what's called cells. So each of these blocks here is a cell. And it really helps when you're doing development work. You could actually run these cells one step at a time. Oop. Somebody else must be using Fabric. We don't have enough capacity to run. Well, I wasn't planning on live running the notebooks through there. But basically, I can chunk my code into blocks and sort of run it one cell at a time as I'm debugging and working from there. When this notebook gets called from the pipeline, it's just going to do a run all of the whole thing top to bottom through there. And the first step here, this is actually an important model that we've built into our notebook approach, is to have a configuration notebook so that as environments change, different workspaces between dev, test, prod, things like that, that configuration notebook can figure out those changes and adjust the flow appropriately because it can be aware of which environment it's running in. So if I come back to my Fabric for a second here, and I look at that config notebook, we're not going to see anything secret in here, so I don't need to worry about the recording because we are using Key Vault to store any secrets. So things like passwords, tokens for accessing HubSpot, stuff like that, all comes from Key Vault. And Fabric has permissions to read those secrets out of Key Vault. You never want to put those secrets into your code itself. It's dangerous from a security perspective. But this can figure out, hey, what workspace am I in? What's the lakehouse for that? What's the SQL server that I need to connect to? What's all my workspace lakehouse information that I can calculate from there? So this notebook runs that. So it's basically a sort of a subroutine call. Go out and call that notebook, get that information, use it in this notebook here. And that way, as we've got multiple notebooks doing different things, they can all call that same config notebook and get a standard set from there. And then I've got a bunch of helper functions. So calling into HubSpot from notebooks was a little convoluted to figure out. The data model that comes back and how you call it is a little bit tricky. We need to deal things like timeouts and throttling. Like if you call HubSpot too quickly and too often, it will give you 429 throttling errors back and say, hey, you're hamming our API too hard. You need to back off. So this code deals with the retries, the throttling and such from there. It puts little sleeps in there and says, okay, I'm going to pause for a minute and then try again and go from there. So it took quite a few iterations to get this all hanging together. These are the kinds of things that I think I could post up and make available to say, hey, if you want to use Fabric with HubSpot, there's no built-in connector for it. But once you get this stuff figured out, it actually works pretty easily. And this deals with the paging to say, hey, I can't go get 5,000 records from HubSpot. I got to take them 100 at a time or 25 at a time and build up my result from there. So the paging is all built into the Python scripts through here, and same with the batching. And there's this concept of associations, which gets a little tricky. So if we come back to, for example, this project. Projects are one of the top key elements that we have in our data model. And projects can have companies associated with them. There might be multiple. There could be with a client and a partner. How HubSpot returns those relationships back to you through its API is fairly obtuse. It took a lot of unwinding to get it back into a form that we could actually manage and work with. So this is actually, building those associations, coming out from that and cleaning that up and saying, hey, I want to take a project and its associations and build out just a list of projects, clients and partners through there. So it's not till we get all the way down here that we see actually one of the calls doing some work. So this is calling out that is the object ID of a project in HubSpot. So it's saying, get me projects and write it out to a HubSpot projects JSON file and get me these properties out of HubSpot. So it actually becomes fairly flexible now. If there's other custom fields, let's say Logan decides to add some new properties in HubSpot for projects that we want to make part of this whole process and ingest that data, we just add those fields into the list here and they'll get added into this JSON file from here. So it's just calling out to that helper function to go get the projects. It gets a little trickier from there when we want to get the company and client partner associations. We can't just say, go get them all. We actually need the list of all the projects and say, okay, for all of these projects, go through them at 100 at a time and find the client and partner associations through there. So that's what these calls are doing is finding that from there. And then once we've got that, let's flatten this out into a simpler HubSpot clients and HubSpot partners. We're going to see this in a second in the data flow. So there is a fair bit of data manipulation happening here in notebooks. And I know I said bronze, you don't want to do data manipulation, but it's really just getting the raw data in a form that we can actually just ingest it. So some of this manipulation just makes sense to do in the notebooks. And earlier steps become inputs for later steps in here. So it all kind of has to happen together through here. And here we're now going to get quotes. So it's the same model we were seeing for projects. What are the properties that we want to see for a quote? Go call the same endpoint with a different object ID on there and get that data back, and then do the same thing. Find the clients and the partners for those quotes. And then in here, we're actually spinning through and getting owner records, which is really users. We want to get the staff records from HubSpot, because when we assign, say, a project manager to a project for one of our staff, HubSpot doesn't record a login name or an email address. It records its own ID for that owner. So we need to translate that into how we think of those people in our Entra ID. So that's really all the data ingestion. And what that's doing is putting all that data into a lakehouse. So we can see here we've got this EIT integration lakehouse. And lakehouses can have both table data that we see here and file data. The final output is to build these gold tables. Those are our master records of what are our client records and what are all the details that came from a number of different systems for that. But before that, we've got a file section, and all of those files that we saw being output from the notebooks are getting written here. So our clients, our partners, I mean, it's a little ugly if you want to look at that data. It's all one big long line. You can put it into a formatter to see better what's happening in there. But it's really to get it into a point that we can ingest it in our data flow. And the EOM groups read is doing a very similar thing. It's calling different endpoint into a different product, but same idea to say, hey, I need to go call into our EOM API, get back a set of results. I need a bearer token, so there's some authorization that needs to happen. That gets stored in Key Vault to pull that data and then ultimately write that out into its own JSON file. So that's kind of the pattern is notebooks retrieve data, they write it as files into Lakehouse, and then that becomes an input into data flows. So let's look at the data flow. This is where all the magic happens. So you can see our bronze, silver, gold layers in here. So if I open up the bronze, it's doing a call out to get the files from the Lakehouse, and then it's building table views of that raw data that came from the source system. So this HubSpot clients is pretty much literally what was in the client's feed from HubSpot. I've added a couple of steps in here because we've done some transformation to obscure real clients and turn the subset down into a demo set. When we get the sandbox going in HubSpot, we'll be able to take that out through there. But it's predominantly just pull that data across. Now we add some columns in here, which are very helpful from a medallion structure point of view to say, hey, what was the source system and timestamps from the source system and when it was imported? So as these records flow through, you can start to track them back to say, where did this data come from? And when was it loaded? Is it current and fresh from there? And we can see the same thing on the project side. So we can pull that together. But then we can see relationships like projects are connected to clients and partners. So these are HubSpot IDs for the projects, and these are the IDs for the clients and the partner records, most of which are known because most of our clients are direct. But somewhere down in here, we've got some partner IDs in there as well. Same thing with quotes, the raw data of the quotes, and then the connections into clients and partners. So this is all of our HubSpot data getting loaded in through here. Now on the Splat side, this is our time tracking software. It's a little bit simpler. We didn't need to go through the notebook because from a source point of view, I can actually point right at the database itself and pull information in through there. So I've got my actual clients, projects, users from the second system pulling in through here. So this is the bronze level. We want to pull that data together. We haven't brought the QuickBooks data in, but we do have the EOM groups information through there as well. So then we move to the silver level and we start to bring that into a normalized data set. We say, hey, let's look at our clients coming from HubSpot. So it's still a record from a source system perspective, but what else do we need to modify on that? And the only thing that we're doing here, there's a bunch of cross queries going on here. We're trying to decide what the status should be for each client. And the business rule is, if a client has at least one active project, then that's considered an active client. If they have no projects or all their projects are closed, then they're an inactive client. And it's something we could manually maintain in HubSpot, but it's better to have the data flow figure that out for us. And ultimately, it's going to update that information back into HubSpot. And likewise, on the project side, it's doing some manipulation around that as well. In fact, these queries relate to each other and pull that information together from there. So we see a bunch of different manipulation happening through these steps here. If you're not familiar with Power Query, we can see on the right-hand side a number of steps that are happening against that. So it's a very visual interface to start to build your queries and add steps through there. You can go into what's called an advanced editor here and see the whole query as one thing. I have to say, I quite often just copy this whole query over into Copilot and say, hey, this is what my query is doing. It's not actually doing quite the right thing. How do I adjust it? And it'll come back with some suggestions, and we just keep going back and forth. And that's actually how a lot of these queries get built out. When we get into more nuanced pieces that are tough to figure out in Power Query, Copilot is definitely your friend as part of that. And ultimately, we're going to come to the gold records here to say, hey, what is our master set of clients and where did that data all come from? So you can see it's merging in, it's got a source, which is HubSpot. It's pulling in the client's data. and it's pulling in the data. So it's taking data from all three data sources here and merging them into a single record. This is where we go from the multiple records per entity into one master record per entity. And this is where we decide what takes priority and precedence through here. Like if we look at the silver clients here, actually the only thing that is pulling it over from the time tracking is what's the SQL primary key in that system over there, because it's something that we used later in other systems. Nothing else is being brought in from there. But if we look at projects as a difference, there is a bunch of things, like when did we start that project? When was the last date that we worked on that project? How many hours did we put in it? What dollars did we put into it? All of that comes from the time tracking software. It's not in HubSpot. So that becomes part of the master record. We pull in client and partner information just so we can see it in there, and we end up with a master projects record, which is a combination of some data from HubSpot, some data from our time tracking, and some data from our extranet user manager. So it's a fairly wide record. There's a lot of information in there, but we can see financial, time information, the clients, the partners and such. All that is in this record here. And this becomes our master record now. So then the last piece, when we want to push this data into the other systems, let's say we want to do some updates into HubSpot, we can basically compare the gold projects record to the silver projects HubSpot record. So the silver projects HubSpot is the one record that's now been normalized of what came from HubSpot. The gold projects is the consolidated record of everything that's supposed to be there for a project. And some fields that exist in HubSpot are actually not edited there. They actually come from the other systems. So this is going to pull back, things like start date and end date. They look a little weird because this is how HubSpot wants to see dates. They're Unix system dates in there. And total budgets are going to change as well. As people track time, that changes the total budget spent through there. And we can actually push this data back into HubSpot. So we're not going to go through that today, but that'll be part of later sessions of, okay, we've got this data here. And what we do with it is we write it out to the lakehouse itself. And that's where those lakehouse tables that we were looking at before came from. So we've got our gold records here. So if we want to look at our gold projects, I don't need to run that query. It's now recorded in this table in the lakehouse. And all those fields that we were seeing here are available. If I want to build an Excel to read this data from the lakehouse, it's very easy to do that and then work with it in my Excel. Same thing with Power BI if you want to do that in Power BI Desktop. But likewise, we can see the updates that need to happen back into the source systems. So we can build another notebook that says, go read these updates and call the HubSpot API and push that data back in. Or call SQL Server and push it into our time tracking software. Not sure if we want to push it into QuickBooks. We may leave that as a manual point to say, hey, just have somebody go and update QuickBooks as part of that. But the nice thing is you can have reports that show those differences to say, hey, here's a reconciliation, and maybe we don't want to automate this piece of it, but here's the records that you should go fix up. And there could be hyperlinks that take you right into QuickBooks to that customer to update that information, depending on your comfort of how automated you want to make this. So I said at the beginning, I didn't know if I was going to go 30 or 45. I guess we're going at the 45 level, so I should stop at this point here. We've got a lot more coming in follow-on sessions. We're going to pace them out about every 2 weeks or so over the summer. Just coming back to the takeaways that we had at the beginning, really the problem that we're solving is getting that single version of the truth to say, hey, let's define systems of records, not just at the company or contact level, but actually at the discrete level within that. And that as you wire this all together and data flows through your enterprise, it provides a lot of accuracy benefits and a lot more productivity through that. So stay tuned for the next session. I think we're still getting the dates locked on those. We should have them set up by the end of the week, and love to talk more with you from there. So if people want to hang back, I'm happy to look at the Q&A or the chat if there's questions there. If not, I want to thank everybody for joining today.
So Peter, one question that kind of came in on the side was, what happens if you have two source systems that disagree with each other. Yeah,
So you
HubSpot has one name and QuickBooks has another name.
So you've got to decide the priority and say where should the master come from? Should HubSpot be the master and QuickBooks needs to be updated, or vice versa? And sometimes there's waiting rules around that to say, hey, we've got a whole sequence. Like maybe it's QuickBooks, HubSpot, and our time tracking software. And maybe time tracking should never be master, but if we're missing the field in HubSpot, then we take the QuickBooks field as a backup from there. So you can start to build fairly complex rules around how you prioritize the fields from the different systems. And as I was saying at the end there, you may say HubSpot is the master and QuickBooks needs to be updated. We may or may not want to automate that updating. Maybe we want to make that a reconciliation report to say, hey, here are differences that need to be brought in.
One more question that kind of came in was, who owns this type of work? Is it a developer? Is it a data engineer? Is it a Microsoft 365 admin? Is it a mix of all of those?
It depends on the org chart of the organization. One of our new clients has a chief business intelligence officer title that reports to the CEO. I mean, that would be the business owner of that. And they may have team members underneath them, or they may rely on IT's dev team to actually do the build part of it. It is very much a pro developer, I would say, more than a citizen developer building these flows. So it's probably within the IT department or a dedicated BI team within the organization.
Great. I think that's all I see for questions. Yeah, just as a follow-up, Peter, I think you mentioned you'll put together some GitHub resources. So we'll follow up with an email with the session recording and the presentation deck and then Peter's GitHub link.
Very good. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.